It had been a long time since he actually really looked at his hands. They were parched, dry and scaly from too many winters. His skin felt thin and soft like well-worn cotton parchment, and a little loose where it used to be tight. The tone had changed, so slow over the years it had been almost imperceptible, lacking the vibrancy of his life's summer, darkening subtly, like leaves in anticipation of autumn. Tiny wrinkles filigreed his flesh. Even the nails had lost their ruddy under-complexion, replaced by an unhealthy, almost jaundiced hue. But they were good hands, strong hands, and they had served him well. All his life he had been fascinated by his hands, enraptured by their complexity, drawn to contemplating them for long periods of time, usually out of doors. Artificial incandescent light simply did not do them justice. His hands, like the rest of him, shared his heart's blood, but they often seemed to act of their own volition, animate whispers of delicate prehensile precision, swaying languorously in mesmerized thrall to his heart's systolic symphony, like strands of kelp beneath the restless sea. But pent-up power lurked below the slip of skin, a swift, nimble strength, a precise ferocity belying their apparent delicacy. As an artist, they were his tools, his vehicles of expression, indispensable to him, in much the same way a guitarist or a piano player, a painter or a sculptor were dependent upon theirs. They were the deltas of his imagination, the receptacles from which the flood waters of his soul collected and were distributed. They were perfectly articulated channels of divine inspiration, the terrestrial palette of the celestial muse, the fountainhead of all his great and variegated work. It had been a long time since he had given himself over to the forces of creation stirring relentlessly within him, since he had offered them sway over his heart and soul. But they prodded ever more insistently of late. The sibilant, impatiently persistent urgings kept him awake late into the evening. Sleep came only fitfully, and the baggage beneath his eyes bore testimony to his discontent. His days were beset upon by a myriad of wistful distractions interspersed with tedious moments of disruptive and beleaguered normalcy. Phantasmagoria coalesced within him into a distinct and clearly delineated vision, the luminous blueprint to a potentially singular achievement. His fingers tingled and his eyes narrowed as he gazed into the far away. But an artist's canvas must be chosen with as much care as the subject to be rendered. The materials were all important. Could Van Gogh have produced Starry Night with a box of Crayolas? Or Michelangelo breathe life into David with an ice pick? An artist lacking the appropriate means of expression is impotent, useless, shooting spiritual blanks. Kubrick had his camera, Don Juan his women, Christ his Christians, and Hitler his Europe. A great man without the proper outlet for his passion is an ordinary nothing, a life whose passing is marked only by the two universal bookends of bloody, painful birth and the devouring of death. A birth certificate and a tombstone, an anonymous tick on the family tree. The selection of the proper medium is an endeavor that must be carefully enjoined, entered into with a calm and steady focus and a fierce purity of motive. The proper hue, word, or texture must not be neglected or overlooked out of haste. Art is sovereign, the absence of restriction, never ruled by the metronomic redundancy of the clock. Freedom cannot be governed or restrained. It has to be undistilled, undiluted, and unpasteurized. Art is the end-all, be-all, the alpha and omega, his raison d'etre. All else is distraction, a mental mummification in the cosmic waiting room. He lived to create, to drink deep the liberty of the process. The periods between the iron grip of afflatus were wrenching flat lines, opiate blurs of lunatic mediocrity, the torture of unexceptional life. For months he scoured the vast canyons of the city for the right voice to utter his timeless tale, the quintessential vehicle for the presentation of his magnum opus. He was only cursorily aware of the passing of time, the exchange of dark for light and light for dark. He slept when he was tired. The search, the muse-directed safari for the ultimate trophy consumed him. He was Parsifal questing for the Holy Grail, and as he had known from the very beginning, it was only a matter of time before he stumbled upon it. Purity was the key. Motive untainted by reluctance or doubt, given impetus by an obsessive clarity of vision. Obsession was an important, no, necessary ingredient. What great and lasting achievement had not been realized without some measure of obsession? What separated the truly great from the also-rans was simply obsession. The ability to abandon all so-called reason and plunge headfirst into one's craft. It separated art from imitation, progression from stagnation. Obsession is pure, the crystal clear ruminant eye of the storm, the unbroken hymen of genius, the prodigy of the unrelenting, a substance pure as driven snow. The first thing he did, even before pulling away from the curb and only moments after slamming shut the door of the van, was to perform a hasty tracheotomy. He could not allow her to speak. That would have ruined everything, spoiled it miserably. It was her voice he sought, and it therefore had to be silenced without any possible delay. No, his voice would speak through her. She was to be his megaphone to the world, to posterity. Her voice would only muddle the pure flow of his work. The best of all wines could be tainted by any number of impurities, however seemingly insignificant to the eye, and likewise sully the receptacle. His receptacle must, of necessity, be pure, a match to the glorious inspiration that provenanced within him. Only the most perfect of all lips could slake their thirst at his wellspring, and that perfection was defined first and foremost by silence. An essential trait, closely followed by that of not squirming while he drove. Both were integral elements to the beginning of his production, of his divine confection, his sublime pastry. For days on end he stared at her, enraptured by every millimeter of the surface of her skin, every pore a tale waiting to be told. He fasted, drinking only grapefruit juice, cleansing himself for the work ahead. His fingers ached as he familiarized himself with her body, so tiny in comparison to his. He remained implacably by her side, his mind ecstatic electric, a tempest roiling about in his skull. The girl was the goddess incarnate, and he the supplicant. his soul poised, ready in the doorway, crouched a tremble at the crossroads. He was the arc in the spine of the diver, the instant before he cleaved the water, penetrating it, enwombed within. The artist in coitus with his medium, union, Ouroboros. He offered her his water, washed her reverently with his hair. He kissed away her tears while anointing the wound in her neck from a scrunched tube of salve scavenged from beneath the bathroom sink. His spirit was racked by the agony of preparation, the forever instant preceding the leap of the parachutist and the swan dive of the suicide, the taut space between the cocked hammer and the bullet, the peace that passeth all understanding, the silence before the storm and the blessed serenity of nuclear winter, the gulp of air before the scream. He cried, sobbing aloud as he caressed her skin, 1,000 times exploring it, charting it, memorizing it. Her flesh was the verdant, lush landscape of his dreams, the country in which he nightly sojourned, and he wept for the ineffable beauty of it. His supple fingers hummed a threnody against its surface, plucked sweet music from the myriad spiders' webs strung about the dark room in devoted ode to his chaste and virginal treasure. Not even fear could mask the wonder wafting from her, producing that precious premenstrual scent, devoid of the taint of stultifying experience, that fetid miasmata had risen from the accumulation of too many seasons. Her glimmering doe eyes bore witness to his fervent obeisance, untrammeled by the glaucomic fog of burdensome years. She was blissfully free of the blemishes that rendered the mature canvas unsuitable to bear the weight of his vision. He loved her. Oh, how he loved her. When the time to begin grew near, his eyes glazed, focused off into the distance as he endlessly combed her hair with his fingers, slowly, savoring the feel of it. He sobered, afflicted by a concatenation of sighs as he steeled himself for the work, unable to hold it at bay any longer. Calmness overtook him, hyper-aware sobriety supplanting the emotional frenzy of days past. His muse focused him, honed him to a surgically artistic razor sharpness. His mind was the glint of sunlight off the point of the needle. He shed his skin, replacing the woolen flesh of contrition with the stained beret of the artist, one set at a rakish angle atop his head. Staggering beneath the preponderant weight of his vision, he stumbled to the bathroom only a few yards away, clutching the basin as he peered into the mirror. He watched her watching him over his shoulder, studied her reflection for a few moments before digging his bic out of the dank recesses of the rusting medicine cabinet and putting flame to the dozens of candles ensconced about the cramped cubicle. Unsteady luminescence fanned out around him and into the room beyond, cloaking him in a sanguine nimbus of ruddy indistinction. With grandiloquent pomp and ceremony, he set about the ritual task of cleansing his hands. He held them beneath the tepid tap water, allowing it to permeate his dermis, swelling it, softening it. He felt the crust of daily accumulation flaking off and dissipated as he lifted them up before his eyes. Staring at them, turning them from side to side, he watched as the impurities evaporated with the water, drifting away into the atmosphere, writhing with the smoke from the candles, lost in the ether. The center of his palm radiated, testimony to the flame burning within, his fingers suffused with a lurid glow. He slathered them with an aloe vera lotion from a little plastic pump stuck to the edge of the sink, sealing the moist, velveteen suppleness just beneath the surface. With loving care, he pared the edges of his nails and cleaned up his uneven cuticles. He held them out horizontal, first one, then the other, steady as rocks. Satisfied, an eagerness welling up from his groin, he turned from the mirror to face the child, the centerpiece of his mostly empty basement. He strode out to meet her as a groom to his marriage bed, hungry and confident. Barefoot, wearing only a pair of stained baggy pants cinched tight about his waist, his stringy hair tied back behind him with a worn leather thong, he set about his labors like some manic impresario. He coaxed, dragged, pulled, and pushed various pieces of unwieldy equipment from the shadows of the room's periphery. Freed of the fusty sheets that covered them, they shone in marked contrast to the grungy, mildewed morass of the basement. They were immaculate, pristine, just out of the box, shiny newness. They bore cryptic combinations of brightly colored numbers and letters, a language indecipherable to the layman, giving no clues as to their purpose, their form equally anonymous in regard to their function. With a precision betraying intimate familiarity, he positioned them in a wide, solemn circle about the girl. All that remained was for them to begin dancing widdershins about her. Pausing only long enough to press his lips tightly to hers, he stepped around behind her, grasping the back of her head in his outstretched left hand. She squirmed. Her strength mostly fled, emaciated from the lack of food and the demands of fear. Her eyes whirled widely about in their sockets, seeking some object upon which to affix themselves. With the sharp, lengthy nail of his right forefinger, he began his first incision at an area just below the base of her skull. Blood flowed in rills down the bare back and shoulders, running in a rivulet through the interstice of her bottom, clotting in her hair. She spasmed like a garden snake with its head beneath the heel of some callous farmer's boot as he carefully peeled away the flesh, determinedly digging and gouging his way between her topmost vertebrae. Following a violently frenzied roller coaster moment, she abruptly hung still and limp. It was necessary to deprive her of physical motility before he could begin his delicate work. He could afford no distraction, suffer no movement, except what his art sanctioned and he consequently performed for her in her paralytic stead. As with any journey, so it began with the single initial step. The tedious, precise, all-consuming work of months uncounted. When at last he stood back, exhausted, to survey the expression of his soul through his hands, it was through eyes adumbrated by dark shadows, perched upon puffy lower lids. He hadn't bathed, indeed had barely eaten, indulging only when the hunger interfered with his work and his gaunt features bore a chapped hue, an unhealthy vitamin-deficient pallor as testimony to his labors. His pants hung from his waist, and his hair dribbled down his neck and shoulders in slick, unctuous strands, beginning to coagulate of their own volition into sticky dreadlocks. The bottoms and sides of his feet were black and raw as pitch, the toenails long and unkempt. When he slept, he lay down on the floor for a catnap next to where he had been working, bitterly resenting the interruption, the interposition of fatigue. Filth smeared his features. Only his hands remained antiseptically clean. Slowly, he circumambulated the completed result of his labors, of his irresistible creative urge, surveying with contented exhaustion the finished piece. It filled most of the basement from wall to wall, from floor to ceiling. Laughter bubbled up in him, the joy of a successful birth, the hysteria of hard-won accomplishment. His breath hitched in his throat. Tears welled in his eyes. He had been right. She was perfect. His crowning achievement, his life's denouement, the laurel that would festoon his name in the annals of artistic achievement. He had given sway to the muse, delivered himself into her hands, and she had moved him. Oh, how she had moved him! Held him aloft to peer blinded into the brilliant face of God. To her and to him a tribute. The child had been lovingly and patiently vivisected with exquisite, savage tenderness. He perfectly calculated the incisions, allowing her flesh to be stretched in divine symmetry from one end of the room to the other, each part interconnecting, flowing, purling into every other part. He'd expanded her, streamers of muscle and flesh and bone and connective tissue, her infrastructure unwound, released from its abdominal cavity as if somehow exploded from within and frozen in space. Every part of her present and intact, unbound from the constrictive confines of the epidermis, her vascular system spiderwebbed throughout the delicately exposed humanity, a graceful diaphanous filigree, pulsing almost imperceptibly as blood flowed through it still, pumped by the heart throbbing at the core, skin and muscle extended out from the center, curving nimbly toward the ceiling, held aloft by a hardening agent of the man's own device. She formed a cosmic lily, petals open wide to receive God's embrace. There is more tension there, he thought, in those countless open, eager arms, than in the gap between Adam and the Lord in the Empyrean of the Sistine Chapel. He'd lifted her from the distractions of material gewgaws. blinded her to the lethal dalliances of societal mores and norms. She need never give another thought to food or to clothing or to shelter, the physical upkeep that so relentlessly drove the bulk of bovine humanity. His machine saw to those needs, state-of-the-art life support. As long as they ran, so would she. Released from human cares into the arms of introspection, rescued from the white noise of touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight, her earthly anchors were severed by his wonderfully talented hands. He'd refined God's creation, offering all who would choose to see a glimpse into the inevitable future of mankind. He'd captured the spirit of the eyes of the child in transparent amber, revering all in the sprawling explosion of the flesh, creating for her a meditative implosion of the spirit. She was spiritual orrery, a perpetual pilgrim at the altar of the infinite, a Cenobite cloistered forever in the temple of God. He stood before what he considered the apex of artistic achievement, a swirling admixture of ecstatic rapture and despair, playing king of the mountain within him. He envied her, longed to be in her place, to revel in her ungoverned freedom, her inner anarchic harmony. But who besides him could achieve such a thing? There was no one. He stood there with her, isolated in his genius, wondering where he would go from there. He had striven unrestricted and succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. His previous life had been preparation for this moment, a long, weary drum roll. He was all too aware that he worked before his time, by centuries perhaps, or possibly thousands of years, but she would survive him by numerous decades, as long as his machines ran. Barring any unforeseen circumstances, she would live. His home was equipped with enough generators to outlast any power failure. Future generations would have abundant, copious amounts of time to study and document his work, followed by an entire future history in which to begin to understand it. He would leave as his legacy the signpost directing humanity toward immortality, toward godhood. His eyelids drooped under the weight of fatigue, and a smile tugged at his countenance. He looked wearily upon his creation and saw that it was good. Surrendering to Morpheus, he lay down on the dank basement floor, sleeping the exhausted, dreamless sleep of the heavy laden. Next to him, in the mind of the girl, the border between the conscious and the unconscious evaporated, their respective contents spilling over into one another, mingling, coalescing. She screamed a new type of scream, one devoid of tongue and breath, one heard in a place beyond the reaches of flesh. Demons howled, angels wept. The sculptor slept on.